let's go to the first false assumption, because what we're dealing with here now, we're basically saying, well, science doesn't lead to atheism, and the assertion that people express that science does lead to atheism is based on four false assumptions. The first false assumption is science is the only yardstick for truth. Now, the first problem with the first false assumption is it's self-defeating. If I say to you guys, science is the only yardstick for truth, and that statement itself has to be true, then I would just basically say to you, can you prove that statement scientifically? No, it's self-defeating. That's the first point. We can all go home now. Let's get our pizza, right? So it's self-defeating. It's almost like saying there are no sentences in the English language longer than 3 words. But I've just uttered a sentence that's longer than 3 words, okay? Now, that's the first point. The second point I want to mention is, well, science is not the only yardstick for truth. Why? Because our observations are always going to be limited. And truth will always change from that point of view. And that's one of the beauties of science. Now, the atheist and the philosopher of science and the philosopher of biology, Professor Elliot Sober, he basically says in his essay called Empiricism that at any moment in time, scientists are limited to the observations they have at hand. Now just think of it, just use your intellect here. It's so obvious that you may have another observation that can contradict your previous conclusions based upon your previous limited observations. So therefore, truth can change in science, which is one of the beauties of science. Truth can change. What we consider to be true can change. So science is limited to what it can observe. And not only can its truth claims change, but its scope and its area of focus is limited. Therefore, it can't answer other questions. Because there are many things that you can't observe directly or indirectly, but yet we believe them to be true. For example, necessary logical truths. You can't observe necessary logical connections or necessary logical links between logical properties in deductive logic. I know that sounds really crazy. I'm going to explain it later, okay? But you can't observe that. And by the way, you have to have that before you do science. So it's limited to observation. The third point, science is morally neutral. Or in other words, it's amoral. Now, what do I mean by this? I don't mean scientists are immoral. Of course not. God forbid, right? What I'm saying here is, although scientists are human beings too, and sometimes we have a culture of think just because he's a scientist, he's like, you know, the religion of the white coats, right? We have that kind of assumption sometimes in popular discourse, right? Anyway, so science is morally neutral. What do I mean by this? Well, there are many things that we take to be first principles in moral theory, in metaethics. Meaning that there are some things that we consider to be objectively morally true. There are objective moral values in the world. There are objective moral truths. Not all of them, but I'm a true believer that we all believe in objective moral truths regardless what society tells us, regardless what individual minds tell us, and regardless what our intuitions or our psychological our emotions tell us, right? So let me give you an example. You go home, you're tired from work or university, and you turn on the television and you see breaking news. And the headline says, man beheads 5-year-old. Now, that's morally wrong, right? Yes? It's morally wrong, correct? Good. Now, next question. Is it objectively morally wrong? For example, if the whole world were to come and say to you, it's okay to behead a 5-year-old, it'd still be morally wrong. And if individual minds, right, and individual human beings with their own emotional disposition came to you and said, no, let me justify it to you intellectually and emotionally, you'd be like, no, it's still morally wrong. This is what we mean by objective. It's outside of the limited human mind in a way, outside of limited emotions, and therefore it requires some kind of grounding. What explains and takes into account the objectivity of that moral value and where did it come from? If we consider some morals to be objective in this sense, science has no say. Science is asleep. It has no say in this issue. Why? Because science can't provide a rational basis for the objectivity of moral values, for objective moral truths and values. Why? Well, let's remind ourselves what Charles Darwin said. He gave an extreme example concerning this notion. He basically said, if we were to be reared under precisely the same conditions as the hive bees, we would think it's okay to kill our brothers and okay to kill our fertile daughters. Now, if you extend that logic and you talk about the nurse shark, one would argue that if we were reared under precisely the same biological conditions as the nurse shark, we would think it's okay to rape women. That's what the nurse shark does. Check the National Geographic. The nurse shark bites the fin of its mate and wrestles its mate, which is tantamount, equivalent to forced mating, rape, right? So there is a problem here, because all the Darwinian mechanism can do, or to be a bit more specific, all that natural selection can do is provide us with the ability to formulate ethical rules. We agree with this. It gives you the ability to formulate ethical rules, but it doesn't give you a foundation to justify or take into account objective moral truths. Why? Because these morals are subject, not objective anymore. They're subject to inevitable biological changes. Not only that, morals lose any meaning under biology. They lose meaning because it's just almost arbitrary. It's like a result of a accidental rearing of certain biological conditions. That's why science is amoral from this perspective, or morally neutral from this perspective. The fourth point is that science can't delve into the personal. Now, what do I mean by this? Now, for my postgrad, I did a thesis on physicalism and neuroscience and the hard problem of consciousness, okay? And this dwells with what's happening inside ourselves, the person, okay? Now, science can't deal with the hard problem of consciousness. Yes, it does great work concerning, how we think, cognition, the fact that we are able to think, and it can deal with all of these things. But can science deal with what really makes us human? The fact that we have inner subjective conscious states. For example, who likes strawberries? I'm thinking of strawberries. I had 400 grams of strawberries this morning. That's what I'm thinking. Right? Everyone likes strawberries, right? Now, when you have a strawberry on a Sunday morning with some double cream, there is an internal experience that you're having. There's an internal subjective conscious experience that you're having. You could ask the question, what is it like for Abdul or Susan or John or Fatima to have a strawberry on a Sunday morning dipped in double cream? What is it like? And that answer cannot be found using science, because we're dealing with someone's inner subjective conscious state. And if I were to know everything about the human mind and map out all the neurochemical, electrochemical happenings and firings, right, and correlate them with someone's experience, I will still not know what it's like for that person to have that experience, because neuroscience is a study of correlations. It's just a study of correlations. So I would not know what it's like for that person to have that inner subjective conscious experience. All I have are utterances, linguistic utterances of the description of the inner subjective conscious state. It's crispy, it's sweet, it's lovely, right? Or whatever the case may be. These are linguistic utterances which represent meaning, which is a representation of what's happening inside. You still don't know what is sweet for that person and what is crunchy for that person. That's the hard problem of consciousness. In a nutshell. It requires another lecture, but that's generally it, right? This is why Professor Thomas Nagel, he makes a really good point, and he raised this point in his famous paper, I believe it was published in 1973 or 1974, when he wrote, "What is it like to be a bat?" Right? And he said, look, science is a problem. Methodologically, it's limited because science is third-person fact. So how can third-person fact deal with first-person fact? There you go. And the debate continues, right? By the way, I'm not saying I've solved the problem here, or I'm expressing, all the views in 5 minutes. That would be highly arrogant of me. It's a big, massive discussion. But generally speaking, when I give these lectures, it's to plant seeds in your heart and mind so you continue your own intellectual and spiritual journey. I'm not here to teach you anything. Rather, I consider these lectures therapy for myself, right? So, the next point, Science can't answer why things happen. That's another limitation of science. Imagine my auntie came along here, right? And my auntie's very good at cooking. And she baked a nice chocolate gâteau. Massive one, like 25 inches, right? Chocolate gâteau, right? And then she left. She vowed silence and she left. Let me ask you the question as a scientist. Why did she bake the cake? Why? Come on, scientists. Why did she bake the cake? Sorry? To be eaten. Maybe not. Maybe she just wants to show how artistic it is. That's an assumption. Why did she bake the cake? Oh, scientists. What's the purpose of the cake? That's what we mean when we're saying why. Well, you would never know. But if I asked you how she baked the cake, you don't have to ask her. If you have the right tools, the right method, and the right amount of time, you could tell me how she baked the cake. You know, you could test the kind of, I don't know, protein bonds and all. My science is rubbish, but you know what? We know what's going on in a cake. Something's happening in a cake. There are protein bonds in a cake, right? Well, there you go, I was right. Don't laugh at me. So there's some biology stuff happening and chemicals happening, right? You could assess that and find out how she made the cake, but you can't tell me why on earth she made the cake. So science is limited from that point of view. It can't tell you about the purpose of things. The next issue is that science is not the only yardstick for truth, because there are other sources of knowledge. And for me, this is the most frustrating. It's like people are not even bothered to read a basic philosophy book. Philosophy 101. If you're 16 years old and buy an A-level standard book on epistemology, the study of knowledge, and you would see that there are other sources of knowledge other than just touching and feeling things. One of them include testimony, believe it or not, the say-so of others. And let me summarize what I'm saying with what happened a few years ago with Professor Lawrence Krauss. So obviously I did a few mistakes as well. People change. If you're the same person you were 4 years ago, then you have issues. So, I follow kind of a Bruce Lee philosophy. You should be like a river that you keep on flowing, right? So I'm not the same person. You don't step in the same river twice, as they say, because it's changing, isn't it? Yeah. But anyway, there are some good things to learn from that discussion with Mr. Krauss. And I said to Krauss, hey Krauss, I didn't do it that way, but you know what I mean. I said, hey Professor Krauss, you have a metaphysical presupposition. You think that truth is as a result of what you touch and feel. He said, yes, of course, I'm a scientist. And I said, fine, but there are other sources of knowledge. He said, like what? And I said, testimony. And he sniggered at me. He said, I just do the science. And I said, well, do this science. Do you believe in evolution? He said, yes, of course, I follow the evidence. And then I said to him, have you done all the experiments yourself? Have you done all the science yourself? And then he paused. Everybody started to laugh at him, or lots of people started to laugh at him. Why? Because it exposed his metaphysical presupposition. It is true that he has to rely on the say-so of other scientists, because he ain't going to do the science himself. And if you rely just on your own experiments that you've done directly, you will never have the science you have today. And that's the beauty of human knowledge. You have to rely on other people. And that's why if you study the scientific method, you would see that a key part of the scientific method are the sayings of other scientists, are the conclusions of other scientists. Now you may claim, yes, but their studies are repeatable, and they have been repeated. If you haven't repeated it yourself, it's still the say-so of others. It could be one scientist or 500. The fact that they are telling you the basis of that knowledge is not empirical, it's the say-so of others. Now what's very interesting, there's been a revival in Western epistemology on the issue of testimony in the past 30 to 40 years. For example, you had the 1991 book by Professor Cody. He wrote the book Testimony, a Philosophical Discussion, and he basically argues that testimony is not only a source of knowledge, it's a fundamental source of knowledge. It's fundamental, it's indispensable. And so he basically argues that testimony is not only useful, but it's a fundamental source. And he quotes David Hume, the famous Scottish skeptic, that disagrees with Professor Cody. And David Hume basically says, look, testimony is useful for the wise man, but we only accept testimony because it's in line with our collective experiences. So Professor Cody, being a genius, what does he say? He says, hold on, Mr. David Hume. What do you mean by collective experiences? Because the only way to understand other people's experiences is to ask them and they will tell you. So he's actually shown that testimony, the say-so of others, is fundamental to knowledge. Because if David Hume is saying that, yes, testimony is useful, but it's not fundamental because it has to be in line with our collective experiences, well, how do you know what people's collective experiences are? It's only via testimony. So it's a really good book that I think you should read that shows that testimony is fundamental. Now, by the way, testimonial knowledge could be wrong, just like our empirical knowledge could be wrong. I'm not saying it's accurate. I'm saying it's a fundamental source. Now, what we have to do to find out what constitutes valid testimonial knowledge, that's a different philosophical discussion. And what's very interesting, you have many talking about this. Dr. Elizabeth Fricker, she makes a really good point. She says, look, given my limitations as parametric, given that I'm a limited human being, I can't know everything. I have to rely on the authority of others, which is simple as that. Benjamin McMillan, Associate Professor Benjamin McMillan, he says that in order to have testimonial knowledge, the one who's giving the knowledge has to basically have the responsibility of referring back to people's challenges. And the audience that's receiving the testimonial knowledge, they have to basically, it's within their right to challenge the one who's giving the testimonial knowledge. You have, for example, Emerita Professor Keith Lehrer. He's brilliant. You know what he says? He says, in order for testimonial knowledge to be valid or to be constituted as knowledge, you have to be trustworthy in your assessments on the trustworthiness of others. Now, if a lot of you know about Islamic theology, this is in line with what Muslims have been discussing for 1400 years in the study of prophetic traditions, ilm al-hadith, when we talk about the trustworthiness of the reporter. Anyway, I went too much on testimony. The point is, testimonial knowledge is a fundamental source of knowledge. And I want to end this part by asking you a question. How do you know China exists? Many of us, it's fundamentally based on testimonial knowledge. Even if you have pictures, even if you have images on a map, someone told you that's the picture of Chinese people in China. And even if you met a Chinese person today, well, you have to just believe what they said. It's testimonial, really. Also, what's testimonial is your mother being the one that gave birth to you. You have zero proof. Don't even tell me you have a DNA test certificate, because you don't. And if you did, that's still testimonial. It's a certificate, a testimony that someone did something. You didn't do it yourself, right? So from that point of view, how do you know your mother gave birth to you? You only know because of testimonial evidence. The fact that your dad told you, the midwife told you, there's a certificate, there may be a video, right? The video is not empirical because you didn't come out like that, bro, did you? With a beard and glasses and a laptop. Imagine, that would be a miracle. God exists, right? So you weren't capitated from your mother's womb like that, were you? No, you had a different face. Obviously far more cuter. So, yeah. So from that point of view, someone have to tell you, hey, that was you when you were a child. So when it comes to things like China and the existence, the fact that you believe that your mother gave birth to you, it's all testimonial knowledge. So it's not true that science is the only source of truth, the only yardstick for truth, because we have other sources of knowledge like testimony. Final point to deal with the first assumption, which is science cannot prove necessary truths. And this is very interesting. Science can't prove necessary truths, and these necessary truths are required before you do any science. For example, logic, logical reasoning, deductive logic. Number one, all bachelors are unmarried men. Number two, John is a bachelor. Number three, therefore John is a unmarried man. This is what you call a valid deductive argument. It's also sound. A valid deductive argument is where the conclusion necessarily follows from the previous statements or premises. A sound deductive argument, if it's valid and also the premises have some form of justification. This is a sound deductive argument. I repeat, number one, all bachelors are unmarried men. Number two, John is a bachelor. Number three, therefore John is an unmarried man. This is a necessary conclusion. Science can't prove these necessary conclusions. Because we know that the conclusion necessarily follows not because of the meaning of the previous premises, but rather there are logical relations between the logical properties of that deductive argument of those premises. There is a logical relation between unmarried, John, bachelor, and men. There is a logical relation. Science cannot warrant, take into account, justify, explain those logical relations. So there you go. You need this before you do any science. And to claim that science is the only yardstick for truth is extremely problematic, because you require necessary truths like deductive arguments or logical relations between logical properties in order for you to even do any science in the first place. So the first assumption, in my humble opinion, is not a valid assumption.
So science is not the only yardstick to truth. Because we understand how science works, we can say these things based upon what mainstream philosophers of science say. Science is limited to observations. It's morally neutral. So, for example, a scientist can tell you what's going to happen when you take a knife and you cut human skin. It cannot tell you whether you operating on someone to save their life is good, or you, like what's happening in London nowadays, getting stabbed left, right and center is a bad thing. So science can't tell you those things. It cannot answer why things happen. For example, I've made a cake and I've baked this cake, and my brother Amir, I want to give him this cake. Science he can use science to tell me the chemical composition of the cake, what temperature it was baked at, and all these sorts of things. But he cannot say why I made the cake. And the actual reason why I made the cake may be that I want him to be overweight and get diabetes, or it may be that I want to put him to sleep and rob him, whatever. I could have a whole bunch of reasons for giving him the actual cake. It cannot delve into the personal. It cannot address some metaphysical questions. So, what does this mean? Firstly, we have this thing, yeah, we believe in science. Science is the way to truth. Okay. Well, put it this way. Science accepts some metaphysics. Metaphysics as in things which are not, we can observe. These are things beyond physics, right? So as a scientist, before I do science, I have to accept the existence of numbers. I have to accept that the world exists, right? I can't prove that scientifically, I have to accept it. I have to accept that the future is going to be like the past. So the sun has risen up today, it's going to rise up tomorrow. I have to accept that every effect has a cause. All these types of metaphysical questions, metaphysical concepts, science simply has to accept. Even logic. Science cannot prove logic, science assumes logic, and the purest type of logic is mathematics. Science has to accept mathematics, accept this. Also, scientists, they have to accept testimony. You can't prove testimony using science, but say I'm a scientist and I was born in, 2010, and not 2010, sorry, 1985. I'll be a very smart, evil child. So 1985, and basically I go to school and I learn about the Big Bang Theory. I learn about Darwinian evolution. I learn about quantum theory. I haven't done any of the experiments. In fact, all the science we've all learned in our life, we've never done the experiments. It's based on testimony. So again, science is based on all these things that science cannot prove, which is not a bad thing. It just goes to show that, I believe in science. Well, okay, fine. If you believe in science alone, then how do you explain testimony? How do you explain mathematics? How do you explain logic? How do you explain the existence of other minds? How do you explain the world is real? How do you explain the fact that we have a mind that we can actually trust? There's a whole bunch of things you have to completely deny. But that's not the way that science actually operates. Of course, there are other sources of knowledge. So if you I'm standing here, and Brother Sufyan, he tries to find out the beliefs that I actually hold. It could be me, it could be anybody on this planet. Anyone sane, by the way, right? Here's the clause, anyone sane. So anyone sane, he wants to find out what's in their brain. If he was to slice my brain in half and look at my roots of knowledge, here's my roots of knowledge. I have direct experience using my eyes. I have testimonial truths. I have scientific findings which I've done myself, and so on and so on and so on. 99%, more than 99% of my beliefs are actually purely testimonial. And that's true with all human beings. The beliefs that you hold are actually testimonial. So for example, do you believe in Madagascar? Yeah, it exists as a country. Have you been there? Okay, have you met anybody from Madagascar? Do you speak Madagascarism or whatever it's called? Okay, how do you know it exists? Testimony. You can say, you know what, I've seen a picture, but someone told you that's Madagascar. It could be Mexico, right? So science, if you say it's the only route of knowledge, then you're cutting off 99% of your beliefs. That's without even going into other things. For example, we can use deductive and logical concepts. Deduction and induction, these are things which cannot be proven scientifically. They are simply accepted by science. So when someone says, I only believe in science, then they can only believe in things they have experimented themselves. And there's for those of you who've seen the debate between Hamza and Lawrence Krauss, Lawrence Krauss says, you know, I believe in science, and Hamza explains to him, you know, science is based on testimony, is based on this. He started laughing. He's like, what's testimony? You know, how's it based on? He explained to him, no, actually, this is the way that philosophers actually understand it. But he asked him, do you believe in evolution? He said, yes. He said, have you done the experiments? No. So again, it's testimony. But even intelligent people sometimes don't realize what they're actually saying. Even when you say, I believe in science, if you walk into the British Library and you walk into the science section, which has, by the way, the British Library, every single book that's published in this country, you have to send a copy there. So every single scientific book that's been published in the UK, we have a copy at the British Library. If you were to walk into the British Library and you're like, I'm a great scientific guy, I love science, and you read all these books somehow, you still only believe in testimony. Because you haven't done the experiments yourself. And our beliefs that we hold, we believe the testimony of geographers, hence why we believe in countries. We believe in the testimony of historians, hence why we believe Plato existed, Aristotle existed, Genghis Khan existed. You can't say Genghis Khan existed if you believe in science purely. Legend says it, because no one knows where his grave is, that they went to bury him, and once they buried him in a secret location, they killed the people who knew where he was buried, right? No one knows where he is, right? Technically. I have a great grandmother, right? 50 generations ago. I can't prove that scientifically. I don't have her DNA, I don't have her clothes, I don't have her perfume, I don't know where her grave is. I know she exists because I exist. That's logic. You can't prove that scientifically. So when someone says, I only believe in science, you're literally shutting off all the doors in the room, switching off all the lights, sitting in a corner, in fact in a cupboard in a corner, and saying, this is my worldview, this few little inches that I can actually see in front of me. So it's actually a very it's a very big problem actually amongst the public, that they think science is a root of knowledge. Sorry, is the root of knowledge. It's of course a root of knowledge, but they say it's the root of knowledge. It's the way of looking at the entire world. Science cannot prove necessary truths. So science can obviously not prove that, it's okay, if A, then B. That's logic. A, therefore B. This simple logic. Any software guys know that you have certain codings, right? So if this, then this. This, therefore this. Science cannot even prove that. That's just completely out of the realm of science. Science just has to assume that these sorts of necessary truths exist.